morning, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for joining us today. The subject for today is using Singapore's Arab legacy to strengthen its commercial ties with the Middle East. Now, the Middle East is one of the world's fastest growing economic areas. Singapore, of course, is looking to benefit from playing a role in the trade between the Middle East and this part of the world. It's still looking on how to best capitalize on these opportunities. And in theory, our Arab legacy in Singapore should help us to strengthen our trade. However, I think certain questions arise as to what kind of policies we need to put in place, what kind of policies should be renewed. To take us through this subject today, we have the honor of hosting Ben Simpfendorfer. He's the Chief China Economist for the Royal Bank of Scotland, or RBS. He's based in Hong Kong. He joined the bank in 2005 after 5 years as a senior China economist for JP Morgan Chase in Hong Kong. Prior to this, he was a sovereign economist at Dun & Bradstreet in the UK. Ben speaks both Arabic and Chinese and has lived in Beirut, Damascus, Beijing, and Hong Kong. His editorials have appeared in the Financial Times, Wall Street Journal, Foreign Affairs, and the IHT. He's the author of The New Silk Road, How a Rising Arab World is Turning Away from the West and Rediscovering China, published by Palgrave Macmillan in 2009. He's also a contributor to a book that will shortly be coming out, entitled The Gulf and the Great Powers, co-published by the UK Joint Services and the US Naval Academy. He holds a master's degree from SOAS in London. Ladies and gentlemen, I give you Ben Simpfendorfer.
Thank you very much. It's a real pleasure to be back here. And I do see my presentation today is very much a starting point. I can see there are a number of experts in the room, and I'd welcome a debate at the end as we try and come up with a policy response to the Middle East's rise and to understand how Singapore might benefit from that rise. I was here a year ago, almost a year ago, to talk about China's relations with the Middle East. And one of my key points was that individuals are central to the growth in China's trade with the Middle East. And as a reminder, China overtook the United States as the Middle East's largest trade partner about a year ago now. In particular, as I researched the topic, I discovered that it is ethnic groups such as the Hadramis, such as the Wenzhou people who are central to that growth in trade between China and the Middle East. And so I asked myself, does this apply to Singapore? Because I was asked at the presentation last year by Daisy Goh from the Singapore Economic Development Board, how could Singapore participate in this trade? And I have to be honest, I did wrestle with the question because I can understand how ethnic groups are important in developing economies, but I wasn't sure about developed economies where rules of law are stronger, market transparency is better. So I found this paper a sort of a useful starting point for myself to really begin to think through this question, because I am looking or considering to write a second book, and one of the topics I did want to discuss is that question of ethnic groups and whether or not they will be replaced by Walmarts. And I'm a romantic person, and I'd like to think that's not the case, because as much as I like Walmart, it's not a particularly romantic place to shop. I did ask the question to a friend of mine. He's a Sindhi trader in Hong Kong. He moved to Hong Kong in the 1940s, and he still recalls being carried up the peak in one of the sedan chairs. He was talking to me about the Sindhi network in Hong Kong, and he kind of shrugged his shoulder to the question and said, well, you know, my son is now a banker, and he's happily married to his Vietnamese wife. So in answer to your question, do ethnic networks matter anymore, I want to say no. And I thought that was disappointing, and to be honest, I don't entirely agree, particularly after what I discovered in this report. So, Singapore and the Middle East, clearly they should be natural partners. Clearly there are opportunities for Singapore and the Middle East. This is a part of the world that's growing at 7.5% over the last 5 years, at least up until the economic crisis. It reached a rate of growth that was consistent with that of the Asian tigers over the last 30 years. Clearly there are some challenges for the region. There is a need to shift away from the oil sector, and certain economies, particularly Dubai, Qatar, are moving in that direction. It's uncertain whether they will be successful, but what I would add is that because of the rise of China and India, and together the two will account for around about 65% of the world's oil consumption, or increase in the world's oil consumption over the next 2 decades. The International Energy Agency estimates that oil prices will trend at about $130 a barrel during that period. So I remain quite bullish on the Middle East over the next 2 decades, irrespective of the structural challenges the region faces. For that reason, Singapore can clearly benefit. The fact that it accounts for 10% of the world's container trade, it accounts for 1 of 6 international financial capitals, and it was ranked by the World Economic Forum as the world's most open city to trade and investment. Clearly, there is more that could be done. I attended an excellent speech yesterday by Amin Taleb on the role of the Hadrami community here in Singapore, and he made the very important point that Hadrami relationships throughout the region are very important for trade. He provided some examples where he had helped out Singaporean companies by introducing them to other Hadramis in the Middle East. And that in turn supported those Singaporean companies in their operations in the region. And there is discussion, and very sensible discussion, I think, about hosting a conference here in Singapore that would bring together the region's Hadrami community to try and reinvigorate those relationships, and for Singapore to take a leading role in that. I think Singaporean companies can only benefit. For me, though, I'm an economist, so I tend to look at economies rather than companies. While I can see how Singaporean companies would benefit from the Hadrami community's relationship, the question I wrestle with is how do you build economies of scale? Economies of scale that are large enough to have significant impact on GDP growth. Economists like to talk about what would move the needle. And my concern is that the Hadrami community in Singapore has very strong relationships with the Middle East, but still is very small in size at about 10,000 people. If you compare that to the Indian community at 290,000 people, or 8% of the population, you can see clearly that from an economist's perspective, while the Hadrami community's relationships are fundamentally very important, I keep asking the question, how can we build economies of scale in order to move the needle? To do that, I like to use trade theory to create a set of rules, to ask myself, when are these social networks important and when are they not? For what goods are they important and for what goods are they not? Now, trade theory asks a very important, or makes a very important assumption, and that is that trade in a domestic market or trade inside a country is much greater than trade between countries. And in theory, that shouldn't be the case. We should be able to sell to anyone at any time. Now, there are some obvious reasons for why that's the case, and there are trade barriers, both formal and informal. Formal trade barriers are trade tariffs, but it's informal trade barriers that I want to focus on today. And informal trade barriers could be cultural differences, language differences, market transparency, rule of law. Social networks play a very important role in trying to overcome those informal trade barriers. So I want to dig a little bit more into that trade theory to try and create a set of rules. There are 2 very important rules. The first is that informal trade barriers tend to be higher in emerging markets. And again, that makes a great deal of sense because emerging markets tend to suffer from a lack of market transparency, weak rule of law. I'm reminded here of an email I received the other day from a Lebanese entrepreneur who I met in Shanghai not long ago. He'd returned to Beirut. He wanted to set up an office trying to introduce Lebanese companies to China, but clearly found or faced very high informal trade barriers. So he'd asked me, can you recommend any consultants in China who assist foreign companies to set up operations in China? And fortunately, I could. There's a company called Desshire. It's based in Shenzhen. And I made the introduction, and hopefully they'll progress with that. We will see more Lebanese companies in China. But I think that's an excellent example of how social networks can be used to overcome these informal trade barriers in emerging markets. The second rule is we need to distinguish between the types of good we're selling. There are 2 types of goods that trade theorists like to distinguish between. The first are goods that have reference prices. goods that have referenced prices tend to be traded on an exchange. There tend to be only a few number of goods or types of goods available. And the quality of the goods tend to be the same regardless of where they are imported from. Oil is a good example of a product that has a reference price. Oil is traded on an exchange. If you want to see the latest oil prices, you can pick up a copy of Platts, a supplier of energy information. There are only a limited number of types of oil you can buy. If you wanted to buy sweet crude, for instance, whether it's from Angola or Saudi Arabia, the odds are that the quality of that product will be relatively the same. And as a result of that, oil buyers certainly don't go out to inspect their product before they make a purchase. That's an example of a reference good. A differentiated good, however, is a product that is not traded on an exchange. It's a product for which there are multiple types sold. It is a product where the quality can differ not just between country, but between factory and even between shipments. Differentiated goods mean that a buyer, for instance, of a DVD player might have to go and inspect that factory, might have to go and inspect that product before they make a purchase. So if you're an Atlanta retailer and you want to buy a Chinese-made DVD player, it's not enough to pick up a magazine and place an order. More often than not, you actually have to visit China. Like I say, inspect that factory, inspect that product before you place your order. But that can be challenging. And so in order to get over those informal trade barriers, we then create social networks. And in this case, I would say a Chambers of Commerce is a good example of a social network where that buyer out of Atlanta go and visit the American Chamber of Commerce and seek advice on some of the challenges that he might face, or ask who are the preferential manufacturers of these DVD players. Calculations of differentiated trade as a share of total trade. James Roach, a well-known American economist, would put that figure at 67% of total trade in 1990. That's up from 56% of total trade in 1970. Now, my own estimates would say that share has since risen again, and I would put it at around about 75% of total trade. So the important point is that differentiated trade accounts for around about 75% of total trade and faces very high informal trade barriers, meaning that social networks are fundamentally very important. So the upshot of that is we have two rules. Social networks tend to be important when we're selling first to emerging markets and second, differentiated goods. Now, critics will argue, such as my Cindy friend, that we are seeing the end of social networks. Now, I would disagree. And their argument is based on the assumption that the world is developing, that rule of law is improving, market transparency is strengthening. I think there are two reasons to argue against that. First, and again, to use our two rules, emerging markets are accounting for a growing share of the global economy. Over the last 2 decades, their share has risen from 39% to 50% of the global economy. So increasingly, we are having to sell not at home, but abroad, and abroad to emerging markets. And it's one question we're here today asking, how is it that Singapore can benefit from the Middle East's rise? We're not asking how Singapore can benefit from the United States' rise. So we're looking at developing, not developed economies. The second point I would say is that because of outsourcing, so increasingly DVD players, for instance, are manufactured not in the United States, but in China, the share of differentiated trade to total trade is rising and will continue to rise. As a third point, and I do want to distinguish between ethnic networks and social networks. Ethnic networks are just a subcomponent of social networks. Social network could include, as I mentioned before, a Chamber of Commerce. It could include an alumni association. It could include just the fact that we all work for the same bank. So we need to broaden our understanding of what social networks are, even if ethnic networks are not necessarily playing the same role as they did in the past. I also would like to refer to China's experience, and I say that because there is a tendency when people hear that word ethnic network to say, well, this is something we don't want to do because it might result, if we encourage ethnic networks, it might result in ethnic conflict. That's certainly not China's experience. China is a country that clearly worries about ethnic conflicts, but at the same time, it is willing to use its ethnic networks and more broadly its social networks in order to spur its trade with the Middle East. China's Muslim population, 20 million, that's the official number. 10 million of those are Hui Muslims. They are the original descendants of the Arab traders who arrived along the Silk Road, and you find them all across the country. They speak Mandarin. They look no different to the majority Han Chinese. The Chinese government is very effectively using the Hui Chinese in order to support its trade with the Middle East and to draw on the Hui Chinese social networks. In Ningxia province, the central province, a relatively poor province, they are creating a halal food industry with the intention of selling to the Middle East. In Yiwu city, a short drive south of Shanghai, there are over 200,000 Arab visitors every year. The city has mosques, halal restaurants, and over 1,000 Arabic-speaking translators. And most of these are Hui Muslims, but all with the intention of trying to attract more Middle Eastern traders to the city. Again, I think this is a good example of how we shouldn't shy away from ethnic networks, perhaps think more broadly in terms of social networks and how we can use them in order to spur our trade, Singapore's trade with the Middle East, just as China has done. So the question, of course, is what about Singapore? Singapore has some excellent examples of both referenced and differentiated trade. Oil is clearly a case in point. Singapore started off as a kerosene distribution hub, but has grown quite rapidly, particularly benefiting from a lack of investment in Indonesia and Malaysia's refining industry. And as a result of that, its oil exports are worth around about $82 billion a year. Its oil trade or exchange trade is worth over $500 billion a year. A good example of a differentiated product is the oud trade. And I was delighted to have the experience to visit a distributor of the product just a few months ago. The oud is made from agar wood. It's a product that after infection releases a resin. It's a wood that after infection releases a resin, and when that wood is burnt, the resin releases a very sweet smell. It's found in the jungles across Southeast Asia. It's imported by Singaporean oud traders before being sold on to primarily the Middle East. So if you were to visit a Saudi Arabian home, you might be greeted by the guest holding some burning oud to release a very sweet smell into the home. Clearly, this is not a product that is sold on an exchange. Clearly, this is a product where there are multiple types of oud. The quality will differ by type and by distributor, and social networks are very important to trade in what is a differentiated product. The good news is that non-China emerging markets account for 63% of Singapore's exports in 2009. Now, I say non-China because a lot of China trade is really just export processing intended for Europe and the United States. So the majority of Singapore's trade is with countries that have high informal trade barriers. That's the good news. The bad news is that oil and electronics account for 55% of Singapore's domestic exports. I would count both these products as referenced goods, goods that are largely traded on an exchange, goods for which informal trade barriers are not all that high. Electronics, perhaps some people would debate, but 35% of electronics exports are integrated circuits, for which there is an exchange, for which the quality of the good doesn't differ all that much by country or by supplier. So it's a question I wrestled with for a while and asked myself, if Singapore is in the business of selling referenced goods, are social networks all that important? And I would say they are. And I was reminded of this last week. I've been touring marketing in the United States with a Singaporean economist, and he made the very important point that it seems to be that Singapore's government is increasingly focused on its service sector and is willing to let market forces determine the future of its manufacturing sector. And there's good reason for that. Singapore's service sector has risen from 36 to 43% of GDP over the last 20 years. Its service exports have risen from 23 to 30% of GDP during the same period. So there is good reason to focus on services sector if you want to, again, move that needle. Trade theory doesn't talk about services goods. And that's largely a function of the fact that there's actually not much economic data on services sector. It's very difficult to measure. So there is a tendency to focus only on physical goods. But I would argue that the same rules apply. that when you try to sell services into an emerging market, you still face very high informal trade barriers. And at the same time, there are both examples of referenced and differentiated service goods. A referenced service good could be a shipping fee. These are quoted on exchanges. You can pick up a copy of Lloyd's, provider of shipping information, to determine the most recent price. The quality of shipping services probably won't differ all that much between countries or suppliers. And you certainly don't have to go out and inspect the ship before you decide to place or sign a contract. An example of a differentiated service good, however, might be a service contract for a 5-star hotel. The price is not traded on an exchange. The quality will differ by country and by supplier, and you certainly do have to meet with the service provider before you sign a contract. So I do think, again, the same rules apply. Singapore is increasingly selling services, increasingly looking to sell services into the Middle East. So social networks will play an important role in trying to overcome those informal trade barriers. So here I want to talk more specifically about some policy recommendations, but I think it's worth just raising the example of Prime Minister Wen Jiabao, who was speaking recently in Cairo, just 6 months after President Obama. Usually these speeches are just full of economic numbers. They're fairly dull reading. This speech was different. This speech, in the first few paragraphs, specifically made the point that China has 35,000 mosques. It legislates that halal food must be provided by all public institutions, whether it's a government office or it's a university. He also made the point that a story of 1001 Nights is widely read in China. He was directly appealing to his Arab audience, directly trying to re-establish those social networks that had long existed between China and the Middle East. He was directly saying, you are welcome to visit China. And I think the symbolism was important because, again, as a reminder, President Obama was there only 6 months earlier, largely having to apologize for the events of the previous 10 years and to remind Arabs that they are welcome to the United States. So, two specific recommendations here. The first relates to building economies of scale with social networks. So again, I want to emphasize this point that I think the Hadrami's relationship with the Middle East is fundamentally very important. It's something that Singapore needs to build on. And the idea of a conference, I think, is an excellent idea. But again, from an economist perspective, I keep asking the question, how do we build economies of scale? Because clearly, a population of 10,000 Hadramis is not large enough. I would say education, service export. There's a need for Singapore to try and attract more Middle Eastern students to study here in the same way that the United Kingdom and the United States does. These students will create new social networks. After graduation, they may decide to stay with or to work for Singaporean companies, particularly service companies. If that's the case, then they may be able to utilize their contacts back in the Middle East to support Singapore's service exports to the Middle East and overcome those informal trade barriers. They may return to the Middle East where they work for Middle Eastern companies and at the same time will recall some of their contacts back in Singapore. It's not just graduates that Singapore could target. It could be executives. I think Singapore has some excellent business schools. In my conversations with many Middle East investors, I'm often told we would like to invest in this part of the world, but we don't have the experience. Singapore does. It has a multiple number of companies that have experience investing in Southeast Asia, have experience investing in China. It would make some sense to run executive education or executive programs here, whether it's a week, a month, a year, to teach Middle East investors what it is like to try and invest or open up a company, whether it's Indonesia, Malaysia, or as far north as China. Provide an opportunity to expose Singaporean companies to those executives. My second point would be more perhaps directly related to Prime Minister Wen Jiabao's speech and the idea of trying to welcome the Middle East to this part of the world. And here I think Singapore can draw not so much on the Hadrami community's relationships, but the Hadrami community's legacy. And by that legacy, I mean mosques, halal restaurants, and historic sites. Tourism would be my first case in point. The number of Middle Eastern visitors to Singapore has increased, but it's increased from 70,000 to 115,000 over the last 10 years. Sounds impressive. Here's another figure. The number of Middle Eastern visitors to Hong Kong has risen from 59,000 to 172,000 during the same period, a bigger increase. My question would be, why is it that Hong Kong finds it easier to attract Middle Eastern tourists than does Singapore? So that simply shouldn't be the case. Many of the Middle Eastern visitors I speak to say we appreciate the ability to be able to shop in Hong Kong, we appreciate the five-star hotels, we appreciate some of the theme parks such as Ocean Parks. Singapore has all this, particularly with the opening of the integrated resort scheme. What I would suggest, though, is perhaps Singapore could learn from the example of particularly of Doha and Dubai, where they are recreating. I should say there is a resurgent pride in the Middle East's history, and they are recreating that history by either renovating or reconstructing the city's old souks. The fact that a recent mall in Dubai was named after Ibn Battuta, the region's equivalent of Marco Polo, just underscores that pride in the region's history, and I think it's something that Singapore could tap into, and perhaps not replicate directly, but certainly could renovate the Arab Quarter, could certainly try and tap into Singapore's history over the last 1,000 years as a trading port for the Middle East, in much the same way as Doha and Dubai are focusing on their own history. The retail sector could be one beneficiary. I would suggest we need a dedicated Arab shopping strip, but preferably near the Arab Quarter. And it should be competitive with similar strips in both Bangkok and Kuala Lumpur. We could encourage branded oud retail stores to open up in the city, leveraging Singapore's reputation as a centre for the oud trade. Golden fabrics might be popular. Longer shopping hours might better suit Arab tourists used to shopping late. Better regulation of traffic in the narrow streets in the Arab Quarter might be useful. Prohibition of alcohol in the Arab Quarter might be useful in order to attract more Muslim visitors to the area. My final point would be here on healthcare. Health is clearly a major expenditure for Gulf residents. Abu Dhabi has only recently opened up a Cleveland clinic, or has recently contracted to build a Cleveland clinic, one of the United States' more famous hospitals, have over 360 beds. Many Gulf nationals previously would travel to Europe and the United States for their healthcare. Increasingly, they travel to Korea, Singapore, and Thailand. Thailand is a particularly useful example where the Bangkok hospital leverages its own Muslim minority to provide Arab-speaking nurses, provide halal food to its guests. Again, just to refer back to the Prime Minister Wen Jiabao's example of saying, you are welcome to visit our country. We will make you feel comfortable in our country, whether it's through the provision of mosques, halal food, or similar items. I would suggest Singapore could benefit from this much in the same way, benefit from this by, again, much in the same way it hopes to spur its tourism and retail sectors by trying to draw on its Arab legacy, its 1,000 years of history trading with the Middle East, whether it's to develop its mosques, its halal restaurants, or its Arab Quarter, to build museums dedicated to its long-standing ties with the Middle East. So let me conclude there, but again, just to underscore my points, I do think the Hadrami community's relationship with the Middle East is something that's very fundamentally important, that needs to be tapped into. But if we're going to build economies of scale, we need to think a little bit more broadly and trying to tap into Singapore's service trade with the Middle East. And again, I think a focus should be on the Arab Quarter and trying in a way to replicate the examples of Doha and Dubai over the last few years. So like I said, this is a starting point in my view, and there are a large number of experts here in the room, and I'd love to hear a debate on the subject, and hopefully we can come up with some policy options. So thank you very much for your time today.
We have about 40 minutes, 45 minutes for questions, and we have a couple of roving mics available. Could I open the discussion to the floor? Gentleman in the front row. Could you please identify yourself?
Yeah, Patrick. in the public, from the private sector. Okay, I'd like to know more about the social networking. Okay, because if, let's say, if I'm not mistaken, the Singapore FTA or whatever being signed with EU or other larger economy of scales with other trading partners. But I'd like to know about this social network that you mentioned about, based on economies of scale. Have you actually identified which Arab countries are strong in specific expertise field, and that you can actually tap into their resources?
Well, I think all the Gulf markets are important, and I think Qatar would be a good case in point. Qatar has increasing interest investing certainly in Southeast Asia, and certainly would be looking to Singapore, I think, to draw on its own experience. And so establishing again programs that attract Qatari students or executives to Singapore to study for a short period of time would help them build up those social networks to then in turn to try and exploit Qatar's own robust growth. I mean, this is an economy that is one of the world's largest gas producers, is shortly going to open up one of the world's largest gas refineries, and has a very ambitious construction program, and is looking to turn itself into a services hub for the rest of the region. So I think there are both opportunities here for both Singapore to build those social networks while at the same time sell their services, service exports into Qatar.
But I'm more concerned about, because with this social networking and the reference prices of the goods, like oil trading, if I'm not mistaken, about 2 decades, the most about 3 decades time, most of the countries will be running out of oil by that time. So I'd like to know whether you actually can accurately identify which Arab countries moving into some joint energy source, say research venture type of thing. Singapore can actually tap into their joint venture into these new energy sources, because I believe they are now already looking into new energy sources to replace the oil, because oil is going to be running out soon. So I think we have to work with them to identify whether we can share a common area of expertise, join our resources to maximize our resources with them, and then we can look into new energy sources, because I believe they are also looking into new energy sources. That could be what you mentioned about reference prices of goods for further cooperation in the specific industry. Really, what do you think of that? Thanks.
I certainly think there are opportunities in clean energy, and you only have to look at Masdar in Abu Dhabi. And at the same time, I think the University of Texas in Qatar is doing some exceptional work on desalinization. Solar power. I think these are certainly opportunities for Singaporean companies. But again, I would make the point that they are opportunities to sell service goods, which are differentiated goods and which will face informal trade barriers. And so it's not enough to just simply turn up on the doorstep and try and sell these products. You need to build the social networks in order to tap into the Middle East. And I think, again, I'm not talking here about selling specific products. I'm really talking about trying to think more broadly to establish a foundation upon which Singaporean companies can spring off into the region.
One last point to bring up. That is also based on economies of scales and also on the transportation costs. Okay, let's say if we are able to sign an FTA with something like EU market, you sign with a joint Arab countries, you can actually identify on this group of countries in the Arab region have a very strong capacity of growth in a specific industry area. So when it comes to trading, you can actually lower your transportation costs, your overall operation costs. Because in terms of bulk transportation of the specific goods into that market, once you go into a specific country, FTA is signed. Once an FTA is signed, that means the goods can actually be distributed through the same channel. There won't be double taxation or all this that can actually incur onto the overall cost of the final product to the consumer. So I think that's also another area to look into. Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, but perhaps I could try and bring it back to where I think Ben Simpfendorfer is coming from, which is that FTAs and analysis of the economics is only half the picture. Social networks, actually who you know, who you can trust, particularly in the case of differentiated goods.
That's I think where he's arguing will make the difference. FTAs are purely a framework; they are not a social network. Next questions.
Morning. My name is Abbas Keshwani. I'm a student. I really appreciated your address. I particularly enjoyed your use of statistics because it helps to put things in perspective. I had a question actually as to what you said with regards to using historical ethnic communities. Because, well, I mean, I agree with you. It's very important to basically make, for example, Arabs feel welcome in Singapore and make them feel like we understand them. But in this age where anybody can learn a language and anybody can basically adopt a culture, and also keeping in mind the fact that many of Singapore's own Arabs, I hate to use personal examples, but I have a few Arab friends who are Singaporeans, and most of them don't really speak Arabic. They've never been to the Middle East. So are they really relevant as an ethnic community to helping improve this relationship, or could it be just informal? Thank you.
I'm going to answer this, but I wondered, Amin, if you wanted to make a comment on that.
So just behind, if I could invite Dr. Amin Talib, who is with the Arab Association of Singapore.
Good morning. What Ben was talking about was social networking, and in the sense of the ethnic, using the ethnic group because they have their own network. And really, one of the main differences between the social networking using ethnic groups as compared to social networking as understood in current day is ethnic group social networking is actually inherited network, which means you are born with it. It's a network that uses your clan and your surname. So the fact that I introduce you to somebody does not mean that I have ever met that person before. All it means is that that person knows of my name, I know of their name, and automatically we are connected. I think probably the Sindhis in the room understand exactly what I'm saying, because the Sindhi community operates exactly in the same fashion. And this ethnic social networking is actually very important for first introductions. Not, as you said, it's not something that you depend on to build the whole country. But however, it is something that's actually quite vital for first introductions. And I think where it becomes very, very powerful is in two areas. One is in medium-sized and small companies wanting to venture in the Middle East, because the big-sized companies do require the social network. Even Supawa, even BSA require the social network. Where do they get it from? They get it from the government. They are using government-to-government social networking. They are using officials. They are using the government to open doors for them. Some businesses actually are not in a position to be able to use the government to open doors for them. So what do? They go to chambers of commerce. They go to SPF, Singapore Business Federation. And these people desperately try. They take delegations there. They meet fellow businessmen. Some deals happen, some deals don't. But really, if you have a social network, when you are going across and you have the introduction, all that's required is a basic introduction. It becomes quite vital, quite important in opening doors and starting the business relationships. The other thing he mentioned, so the fact that he said that there are some Arabs in Singapore who don't speak Arabic and so on, it doesn't really matter. It's not about language. It doesn't even matter really if they don't even understand the culture. It doesn't really matter even if they don't practice it. Because they still carry the surname. They still are part of this network. When will it matter if someday the Arab community decides to drop their surname? If someday, instead of calling myself Amin Talib, I start calling myself Amin Ali Saleh, then I have lost it. I have lost that social network. Okay? All right, thank you.
Thank you.
what I would add to that is, you know, Amin makes a very important point when he mentions that the ethnic networks are inherited networks, and so they're fundamentally they're much stronger, and it's very difficult to recreate that. And so as an economist, when I ask how do we build economies of scale, how can we turn a Hadrami community of 10,000 into an Arab community of 500,000 in order to build even bigger ethnic networks? And I guess it would be to draw not the Hadrami community's current relationships, but its historical legacy in order to attract Emiratis, Kuwaitis, Saudis to Singapore, perhaps as students. And I think students are ideal because it offers time to be able to establish what is a very strong relationship. So when they do stay here or return home, we can also leverage off the back of their own, either it's an ethnic network or a more broader social network, and so to build those economies of scale.
Yes, maybe come in again.
I think what you said is a valid point about, was mentioned earlier also in the presentation about using the Arabic history and Arabic legacy to strengthen the ties. And of course, having students from Singapore is one of the most excellent ideas. I mean, that's what makes London a special place for everybody in the world, the fact that they have studied in London. The other thing is, one of the things, there's two things he sort of mentioned also in passing, I just want to re-emphasize that point, is when Singapore companies, Singapore delegations go to the Middle East, there are two things they don't actually do. One is, there is very little education in the Middle East about what's going on in Singapore, in the sense of, when they go, they should be taking, somebody from IE is in the delegation, there should have been something like similar like this, where it is how to do business in Singapore, what is Singapore about, and so on. And in that seminar, they can actually also talk about, I think I've many times I've even told STB about this, that what STB needs to do, that when businesses go down in presentation, they should actually mention the fact that there is Arabic quarters in Singapore. Just mentioning the fact that there is Arabic quarters in Singapore, mentioning the fact that there is Arab Street, mentioning the fact that there is an Arab community in Singapore, is actually building on the legacy. It's telling the Arabs in the Middle East, I think we can understand you because we have been living with Arabs all these years. So it would be easier for us to understand you than understanding some other people who have never had connections with before, right?
We have Anthony Chiu.
My name is Anthony Teo. I prefer Amin's broader view of ethnic and social relationships, because I think if we follow your specification, it's a very narrow window to jump. That 10,000 Hiramis is too small is very literal, because I can give you an exception. So in China there are 35,000 mosques, but they, since Zhou Enlai went to China, went to Egypt 50 years ago, the intervening period was actually like a blank time. But my point is this: Korea has very little social or ethnic network with the Middle East. And they have for many years, since the 1980s, been major contractors and builders in the Middle East. No ethnic or in any particular way ethnic network, not even mosques. Very few mosques. There are mosques in South Korea. But I think the issue is this: from 20 years ago, construction, they've morphed into nuclear technology. And now they are the contractor to the Qataris for nuclear weapons, for nuclear energy, compared to my friends from France. Yeah, and that transformation is important. So your issue of replication, I think replication is very dangerous because it's a very low level type of equivalence. What we need to do is to transform. So here we have some of our networks that have worked so far, and we brought the banks from Middle East here. The transformation is now we have Islamic Bank, originally GIB here, 1980. The same group of shareholding people is now with DBS in the Islamic Bank. Okay. That nature of transformation, I feel, is more important than replication. So I have basically 2 points. One is people without ethnic network can still work there. The Korean is an example. And the second bit is not replication, but transformation.
It's a very important point, and to be honest, I don't think we disagree all that much. I guess what I would argue is that I think the Hadrami community is very important, but I think we need to try and expand beyond just the Hadrami community to try and create communities of whether it's Emiratis, Kuwaitis, Saudis, all have experience in Singapore. So that when a Singaporean company has to compete with a Korean company, you make a very important point, Korean companies are very competitive in the Middle East. But my question would be is if the Singaporean company provides an identical service to the Korean company, then I think that that social network, the fact that perhaps the guy on the other side of the table who's signing the contract has perhaps studied in Singapore, perhaps has visited Singapore as a tourist, perhaps might be more inclined to sign the contract with that Singaporean company. So just providing that, I agree with you that Singapore needs to continue to move up the value-added chain. And that's what makes it a competitive place. But what it can is comparative advantage in terms of its social network with the Middle East is something that Korea can never replicate. And I think it might just provide that additional edge that will allow Singaporean companies to win.
My name is Farid Alatas from National University of Singapore. I would like to look at things in a slightly different way. Many of the things you suggested in terms of developing ties with the Middle East, attracting Arabs here for education, medical tourism, revamping, renovating the Arab Quarter and so on. These things, of course, can be done. I think a lot of it can be done without reference to the Arab community here. Although the Arab legacy, the history of it, is something that it would function in terms of attracting the Arabs. So for me, I would sort of put the issue, the other way around. Rather than using Singapore Arab's legacy to strengthen its commercial ties with the Middle East, how can Singapore's strengthening its commercial ties with the Middle East rejuvenate the Arab community? It's the other way. Because I think that if social networking is definitely important, the question is, to what extent is the Hadrami element in that networking important? Now, I would say that the extent to which it's important depends a lot on the quality of the community. 10,000 to me is not a small number if the quality of the community is very strong. And I think what is lacking today is a kind of vision within the community in terms of how it sees itself in the next 20, 50 years. That is going to affect how the community educates its children. Where is the stress? Is it on developing professionals? Is it on developing religious leaders? So I think these are some of the issues that are left out. Now, a small community with highly skilled professionals can have a great impact on the kind of ethnic social networking you're talking about. Now, in the absence of that, I think Singapore can still do a lot. The question is, to what extent is the Arab community going to benefit from that and use that as an opportunity to bring itself up as well?
Please.
I just want to clarify one point before you give your answer. Because it was said that the Arab community has no vision for the community in the next 30 years. I mean, I would like to clarify and disagree. because I'm part of a small group that we very clearly have a vision for where the Arab community is in 20, 30 years. We're very clearly trying to do things for the Arab community as a whole.
I agree with what you're saying. I think it's a very interesting point. And as an economist, I'm a big believer in market forces. And I think, I do agree. I think if Arab tourism, Arab medical care, Arab education was to all improve in Singapore, then market forces would help to buoy or improve the quality, as you say, of the Arab community, to produce perhaps more Arabic speakers or to produce more highly trained graduates. I do agree completely. Yeah. In a way, it's a self-reinforcing cycle.
Okay. Thank you. I enjoyed the lecture, Ben. It was excellent. I just want to give a little insight about the legacy in the Hadrami mind, or who is the Hadrami. Okay, I think we need to add that to understand what actually brought the Hadramis to Singapore and how have they succeeded in Southeast Asia. Once we understand that, then we can tap, even if perhaps a large number of the local Arabs or Hadramis, because when we talk about Arab legacy in Singapore and the Far East, it's all about really one group of ethnic group, which is a Hadrami group, Hadrami Arabs. Now, the Hadrami came 300-400 years ago, 200 years ago, and went to the farthest island in the Malay archipelago without really knowing what kind of product he will find or what kind of service he will deliver. In other words, going across to these borders and finding markets and discovering things is one of the legacies in the Hadrami mind. That is very important. They have reached to the very farthest, to the extent that the very, very small community in East Timor produced the first prime minister of East Timor, who is Marai Al-Kathiri, out of 4% of Muslims in East Timor. So very, very small Hadrami community, but Mr. Al-Kathiri, Marai Al-Kathiri, was for a long, long time in Madagascar, where he grew because of the Portuguese connection, where he grew in the civil service till he became a very, very senior civil servant in Madagascar. So that is the strength. Second thing is what kind of network is there with the Hadramis in the Middle East and beyond. Now the Hadrami network goes well deep into Africa through the Hadramis who are in the Middle East. I'll just highlight here, I'm just trying to make spotlights in the dark areas where nobody really understands. And perhaps this is the opportunities for governments and businesses in Singapore to follow suit, using this kind of network. If you do not tap, you cannot go far. Of course, many countries do very hard work, like China, Korea, in marketing their own expertise. But Singapore is a smaller place, and it needs this extra benefit to actually reach these markets. For instance, who is building the first Trans-Africa railway system? Trans-Africa means east-west. It is two Hadramis who have partnered with Port of Dubai in Djibouti. They're building a very, very successful port for the reason of building a railway from Djibouti all the way to Central Africa. And these two Hadramis are very prominent businessmen in Saudi Arabia. And they are also taking the port of Aden. Now, another thing about the scale, matter of scale and the number of people in Singapore, Hadramis in Singapore. Let me tell you that the opportunity that was given or that was created for Port of Singapore to go to Aden was solely done on the network, was solely created on the network, using the network, which is, there is an opportunity here and there is an interest in Singapore to go and manage Port of Aden. It's only because someone says, I know this person and I know that person, let's get together, and they sat together. And because without understanding this network, it would not have happened without that network. One last word. It's much more difficult to do business or to someone to sell something when all he sees in an Arab is someone wearing a white white dress with a little black circle on his head. That's very, very difficult. It is an attitude thing. When you say, yes, I know where you come family from, your village is so and so, you create a bond. And that bond of a tribal is a tribal thing. That is very, very useful. We understand, you see, I'm very much, I'm interested in actually discovering the unknown, or discovering the thing that is not on the surface, and rediscovering your treasures. And if you do not use that, if you do not rediscover your treasures, you are losing a lot on what you have already built for the last 200 years. So this is where I want to point out, it has nothing to do with, I think, 300-400 good people with good relationships in Hadramaut, in the Middle East, can do wonders. They can open the doors for you, not only in the Middle East, but I would argue in Africa as well. Do you know that the Mufti in Dar es Salaam is also bin Sumer, like the Mufti of Singapore? And they're basically cousins. So, it's endless, because there are researches done over the last 15 years on the Hadrami diaspora, and basically they are spread out all over the Indian Ocean. And there is excellent references for that by Professor Orid Fritaj, which she wrote, Hadrami Traders and Leaders. Now, again, I'll say one last thing I want to say is, who has, from experience, made use of this network, or actually have done a lot to benefit themselves? I think Malaysia is number one. They have excelled, and they have taken now 2.5 million tourists from the Middle East alone. And they have Arab signs in the airport where to go and what to do. And Indonesia is doing the same. What you have mentioned about Thailand is much, much less than what is happening in Malaysia. And I don't know any figures on how much Malaysia has benefited from this link. Thank you very much.
I think if I sort of had to sum up some of those points, we'd be very much at the Hadrami community's relationships here, a powerful tool that perhaps Singapore has not fully used yet. At the same time, I think it'd be useful to build economies of scale by trying to create Emirati, Kuwaiti, Saudi networks here in Singapore as well that match those of the Hadrami networks. And that in turn could reinvigorate the Hadrami network itself by restoring restoring a real pride and sense of community. And again, it's very much a virtuous cycle, and I think Singapore can only benefit. And as was raised before, clearly we need to move further up the value-added chain to provide more value-added services, but ultimately it's those social networks that will provide the competitive edge when Singapore competes, for instance, against Korean companies. I would also say, and this is a more practical example, Hong Kong at the moment is trying to create a Islamic financial industry. At least that's what the media headlines appear to claim. In truth, it's really just asking the question and saying at some point Chinese companies will want to issue Islamic bonds. It would make more sense for them to issue in Hong Kong than Singapore, so they're trying to prepare for that. But when I talk to policymakers about this, they have one fear, and it's this. They say, we have no mosques. We have very few. We have only 2 main mosques. We have very few halal restaurants. How can we compete with Singapore? And I think it's just worth remembering that is Singapore's competitive edge against countries such as Hong Kong. But it does need to be developed further.
Perhaps I could ask a question about education. When you mentioned the value of bringing students, I guess from both regions into the other, but also executive education. Where has this been done well in Asia, or are we really just looking at the beginning of something, because traditionally Arab businessmen do not come to Asia for their executive education, they go west.
I think China has done it well so far, and that's largely because a number of Chinese universities have clearly established joint venture programs with some very top-rated United States universities. And the point is that many of those top-rated universities, United States universities, are also present here in Singapore. So there's two attractions. One is that you are getting a qualification from what is a world-class university, but two, you're getting local experience. So I think China has done that very well, and I think it's something that really Singapore could learn from. So in short, what these programs offer is often it'll be a week in the United States and then a week in China. And you get professors from both the Chinese and the United States university teaching jointly. But I think, again, Singapore could copy that, repeat that, or copy that example, but apply it more specifically to China and Southeast Asia.
Still on education, why is it that the American university, both in Beirut and in Cairo, is quite established and quite successful, despite whatever feelings people say about American thinking?
There's probably people in the room who might be better qualified to answer that, but in short, it's my understanding is this: they've always run a very independent line. They've always run a very independent line and distanced themselves from United States American policy, foreign policy. And most often, I think that's simple as that.
The gentleman brought up a very interesting question on transformation. He quoted Islamic Bank. So how about your views, any areas that we can actually speed up in the transformation process? We can discuss it.
In the Islamic financial industry.
Yeah, Islamic banking fund or whatever. So what are the areas that can actually speed up with this transformation process?
Islamic private wealth. I think Islamic private wealth is Singapore's future. And again, I think it's a huge industry. I mean, private wealth for Singapore's private wealth industry itself is a potentially huge industry. But again, I would emphasize the point that if you can offer to wealthy Arab investors the opportunity to come out to Singapore, feel welcome, and again know that there are mosques, halal restaurants, and a lot to do. That, I think it would be a huge benefit.
It's a long-term transform.
No, I think it's happening now. But I do think more needs to be done particularly in terms of Arab tourism in Singapore. I think that would be useful.
With that, perhaps I can bring this to a close with a little commercial. In April, on the 10th of April, at the National Library Board, NLB is actually launching a program called Islam, Trade and Culture, the Roles of the Arabs in Southeast Asia. The Middle East Institute is supporting this effort, and Ben is coming back, and he will be speaking on the 10th of April at 11 o'clock on Singapore's Hadramis in Today's Economy. So for those of you who have had your appetite whetted by today, please join us on that day. Please join me in thanking Ben Simpfendorfer.